settlers to the place that would be called Anacortes. Good, rich, free, plentiful land to own, to live on, and to farm.
Enoch Compton and William Monks and Hiram March arrived around 1860. Over my shoulder is March's Point, and that's the area where the first white settlers came, and they dubbed it Fern Prairie because it was covered with bracken fern.
Although it was rocky, the ground they picked was good farming ground. The newcomers boasted about the crops they could raise, but there was a more important reason why they selected the particular spot on which they settled. This was the heart of the great Northwest Forest. March's Point was one of the few areas not covered with trees.
Probably more than the richness of the land, it was that they didn't have to cut the trees down. The trees were large, 5-6 feet in diameter, and posed a real problem to anybody interested in agriculture. So the first settlers picked the open land out on March's Point.
Long before men lived here, glaciers had sculpted the land. The last of the glaciers disappeared between 10 and 15,000 years ago, leaving grooves formed by pebbles that had been embedded in the ice.
You have to imagine the enormous pressure of a mile-thick sheet of ice on the rock to actually scratch and form these rocks. It was a tremendous amount of pressure.
Ice literally shaped and reshaped the rock.
And it also shaped the valleys. If one looks out on the horizon out there towards the island where there is a steep slope on the south side of that island, that steep slope was formed by glacial plucking. That means the tearing out of rocks on the southern side of the hill as the glaciers went over it.
In contrast to the steep southern slopes, glacial deposition smoothed and leveled the northern exposures. The glaciers also sculpted the channels through which salmon now swim to their spawning beds in the rivers. Like the land, the waters around Anacortes were rich. The white settlers weren't the first to realize the abundance of Anacortes. Native peoples had lived here for thousands of years.
This particular place is called Lone Tree Point by the tribes. It's almost like a sacred place for us because that for thousands of years this is where the fish school up. Deception Pass is to the left of us here, and a lot of the salmon that head up towards the Skagit River, which is to the south of us here, they come and school up in here and they mill around for quite a while they're eating and gaining their strength to head up the Skagit River to get ready to spawn. And it's an opportunity to do what we did for thousands of years from time immemorial is the name that we call ourselves are the salmon people. We built our whole cycles around the salmon. When the fish were running, that's all we did was fish. You know, we didn't do anything else. So it's like when the salmon are running from June to November, December. This is what we did. And then towards the winter time, after the fish quit running in November, December, that's when the weather started getting cold and everything, that's when we retreated to our longhouses and paid attention took care of our spiritual needs. We had our ceremonies, telling of our family histories, the myths and the legends that had moral value for our young people. And everything we did was spiritual. The gathering of food was spiritual. We always thanked the salmon. We always thanked the deer. We always thanked the elk. We always thanked the clam and the crab for helping provide for us, you know.
Spaniards were the first white men to explore the region.
Carrasco, sailing under orders from Quimper, sailed north from near the Port Townsend area, sailed past Deception Pass, named it Boca de Flan, and continued to sail probably as far north as the opening to Guaymas Channel. The Spaniards first named the strait that is presently Rosario Strait, Boca de Fidalgo. The name Fidalgo was eventually applied to Fidalgo Island.
The Spanish came to visit rather than to stay. Not so the next wave of immigrants, the Americans and the Europeans. The newcomers needed a little help from the locals.
Well, at first when the white man came out here, he was pretty helpless. He didn't know the ways of the Northwest. One of the outstanding aspects of the people here in the Northwest is wanting to be good neighbors. We're a peaceful people. So we supplied the salmon for the early settlers so that they could survive the winter. And we showed them how to live here, you know. So we helped each other out. We were grateful for the goods that they brought out, especially iron, you know, and the tools. So although we are still very traditional people, I would say that we're not averse to progress.
In 1876, Amos and Annie Curtis Bowman reached Fidalgo Island. Amos surveyed the waterfront. He liked what he saw.
On examining the harbor for terminal purposes, which was the first work I did here, I was agreeably surprised to find every condition around Anacortes Place nearly perfect. And in the spring of 1877, I purchased it from Miss Maud Stevens of Boston, a sister of General Hazard Stevens, for the sum of $1,000.
Amos was a visionary. He could see a town carved from the forest, a big town.
Amos Bowman described it as it was going to be the New York of the West. And when they laid out the city, they laid it out to be the same size as the city of Boston.
If he was a visionary, he was also a romantic. He named the town of his dreams after the woman he loved, Annie Curtis. There are conflicting stories about how it came to be called Anacortes.
One story is that the Anacortes, he just corrupted it, modified it to a certain extent to fit in with the Fidalgo Island, the Spanish influence.
Or maybe it was a typo.
It was thought that Amos was going to name the city Annie Curtis, and in communicating with the Postal Department in Washington, D.C., they thought because of the Spanish influence through here, it was Anacortes, and that was the way it came, and it stayed forevermore. That's the legend of how it got the name Anacortes rather than Anacortes.
Old timers, when I came out here, were still referring to this town as Anacortes.
Anacortes was an ideal destination for the sailing ships that rode the prevailing westerlies the length of the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the deep protected waters of the Guaymas Channel. Amos visualized a world-class port where sail met rail, on land he just happened to own.
He was surveying for the Canadian Railroad. He was a mining engineer, surveyor, reporter, very versatile, and apparently very charismatic.
Well, there was always a rumor that Anacortes, because of its seaport, was a strong possibility to become a terminus for a railroad line.
Amos took advantage of the power of the press to promote his grandiloquent vision of the New York of the West, the Manhattan of the Pacific.
And he established the town's first newspaper, the Northwest Enterprise, which he used as a tool to communicate with the power brokers throughout the nation.
Amos was entirely in favor of advocacy journalism. One of his most celebrated journalistic feats was the publication of a map.
He made an incredible map, and that was circulated through the media of his newspaper all around the country. Any place where he thought there might be someone interested in Anacortes as a site for an industry or a rail line.
Amos just was able to convince all these people that this was just the most perfect location for everything.
Amos Bowman realized that we were kind of sitting in the catbird seat, and there was a map that came out in 1890 when he was making his big push for Anacortes that showed Anacortes as being 1/16 of an inch off being dead center in the planet.
He offered half his land to any person or business that would follow his dream. In 1888, the Oregon Improvement Company accepted his proposal and announced plans to build a railroad. By 1890, the public had bought the Bowman dream.
In January of 1890, there were only about 30 or 40 people in Anacortes. By March, there were probably about 3,000 people here, based on the speculation that this was going to become the terminus for the Transcontinental Railroad. And a railroad was built to this place, and in August of 1890, the first train came.
The black train coming, better get your business right.
The local boosters worked overtime to sell their imagined city. Every day, steamships from Seattle and Tacoma deposited new customers on Bowman's Wharf.
I mean, people came in, they came up by boat, bought their land, stayed for 10 or 12 hours, and went back.
Two of the principal businesses they had in town at that time were real estate offices and saloons.
The first order of business was to clear the dense forests that covered the prospective town site.
The saying was that you could see the fires of the trees that were being burned here as far north as Bellingham and as far south as Everett.
To a writer who visited Anacortes in March of 1890, it was a hellish scene.
Thousands of burning stumps sent forth great clouds of smoke that floated far over the straits. At night, these fires were constantly watched and attended by hundreds of laborers. This scene presented a curious picture. The landscape seemed a lake of fire through which the figures of men were constantly moving, reminding one of the scenes in the Inferno.
In the words of another observer, that was the heroic age of Anacortes. Those beautiful solitudes extending from Cap Santa to Deception Pass, upon which a few farmers, lumbermen, storekeepers, and steamboatmen had been carrying on a tough, substantial trade, became suddenly transformed into one of the most typical of all typical Western boom towns, where the boomer boomed, the promoter promoted, the gambler gambled, the grafter grafted, and the sucker sucked. The heroic age was short-lived. The train that appeared in August came north from Seattle, not west from New York. It sparked a celebration among the Anacortesans, but it wasn't the Transcontinental Union of Amos Bowman's imagination.
Towards the end of 1890, there was a panic and the accompanying crash, and several of the railroads went out of business. They were failures, and that was about November of 1890 was the time that people began to take a look at their whole card and wondering if Anacortes truly was the city of destiny.
The local railroadmen had been endeavoring to lay railroad tracks to the east, toward the North Cascades.
They managed to get about 33 miles from here, and then the Oregon Improvement Company went bankrupt. They could not get the financing to continue this transcontinental dream, probably because the North Cascades were so formidable and everybody realized that no railroad would go across those mountains.
When the news broke that the Transcontinental Railroad would not terminate at Bowman's Wharf, the bottom fell out of the real estate market. Virtually everybody who had the means to leave Anacortes did so. The Bowmans stayed on until 1894, when Amos died, believing himself a failure. Annie took it hard.
She was absolutely grief-stricken and desolate. A letter to her sister Sally Childs, she expresses her grief in 1901. He died in 1894. That the light had just gone out of her life. She was still mourning, and the unmarked grave here bothered her a great deal because, of course, he didn't leave a lot of cash, a lot of land. So she never really recovered from his death.
Recovery from the crash was slow but sure.
Anacortes has had many ups and downs, but the next up was probably the fishing industry, the fishing and canneries.
In the 1890s, fish processing plants began to move into the area. In 1891, a cod fishing plant was located here. In 1893, some salmon canneries came. Mills also moved into the area. So by 1896, the town had acquired a good financial footing based on the canneries and the mills.
Anacortes was starting to develop not as the New York of the West, but it became the Anacortes of the West.
Along Fidalgo Bay was the area where the mills were, and the area along Guaymas Channel is where the fish canneries were.
In 1900, there were 2 codfish plants and 6 canneries along Guaymas Channel. By 1915, 11 of the 41 salmon canneries in operation between Blaine and Olympia were located in Anacortes.
It just seemed like a natural place for the salmon canning industry. Easy to get things out of. Back in the early days, there were trains here, and you could ship stuff out by train. And
We were the salmon canning capital of Puget Sound. Had more canneries than any place else. And that was because we were centrally located to the fishing grounds. They were fished to the south of us, they were fished to the west of us, they were fished to the north of us. We were right in the middle of the fish.
They tried Seattle, they tried Everett, they tried Bellingham, but this was the central location from the fishing bank, so that's why they came here.
Essentially, 25% of all the canneries in the Puget Sound region, there were around 40-some canneries, 25% of them were in Anacortes.
Alaska Packers and Fidalgo Island Packers at Ship Harbor. There was Sebastian Stewart. There was Nacket. Of course, it wasn't called Nacket at that time. I think it was called Sanitary. There was Apex, PAF, that'd be Pacific American Fisheries. Lomans, which was, I think, Coast or White Crest. It changed names several times because he refinanced. There was Fish Pack, and there was Booth and Western, and I think that makes 10 or 11.
They claimed it was the largest fishing spot in the world, but other cities along the coast claimed the same thing. But it certainly was one of the most significant fishing areas in the world.
The white man's success came at the expense of the region's traditional fishermen.
It became a business for the non-Indian people, so the tribes start getting pushed further and further away from the fishing industry until we caught just a small portion of the salmon. They wanted to make farmers out of us. We were described as the Indian problem. What are we going to do about the Indians, you know?
It was a wild and woolly place in the early years. People from the little towns up the Skagit River came to Anacortes to party.
Upriver, interestingly, the towns up there had passed prohibition laws prior to 1916, so Anacortes was an open town. They'd have 4th of July celebrations where they offered free transportation by rail to Anacortes, and they had some really wild celebrations in town here.
When the time to shut down for the night, everybody would head for the bars, and it was wide open, boy, I'll tell you. You never know what was going to happen. I know it kept the police busy. A lot of people go to the bar, and if they had to work extra hours, we had to go get them out of the bar to get them to come back to work.
But there were the steady people in town. The communities of Scandinavians and Croatians, which were steady people, family people. And they had their kinds of celebrations too. And their communities, which were tight-knit and very supportive of other people.
The steady people held celebrations like the Mariners' Pageant. On Friday nights, after the fishermen had delivered their catches to the canneries, they held pavement dances on 7th Street between Commercial and Q Avenue.
There was a naughty side to Anacortes, but as I said, they had hearts of gold.
Salmon wasn't the only significant fishery. Codfish was another. In 1891, J.A. Matheson's schooner Lizzie Colby sailed around the Horn of South America en route from Massachusetts to Anacortes. That same year, she made her first fishing trip to the Bering Sea and returned to Anacortes laden with salted codfish. Matheson had constructed the first codfish curing plant on the west coast at the foot of K Street. As the Lizzie Colby offloaded her cargo, the Puget Sound codfish industry was born. William Robinson came to Anacortes in 1897 and began his career rendering fish scraps into fertilizer and glue. He recognized the profits to be made in the cod fishery and turned his efforts there. Early on, he joined forces with the Trafton family.
William Robinson was my great-great-grandfather who came from Gloucester, Massachusetts. He formed Robinson Fishery Company in Anacortes, Washington, and he had the schooners, the Azalea, the Joseph Russ, the Wawona, and the Alice.
If Amos Bowman had likened Anacortes to New York or Boston, Robinson made another analogy.
William Robinson proclaimed Anacortes the Gloucester of the Pacific, and it was a perfect spot for cod fishing.
Robinson Fisheries grew into one of the largest codfish plants on the West Coast.
When the Wawona first came down, they would dry the fish on the dock, and so the whole dock from all the way in from the outer portion was covered with wire racks where they would dry the salt cod.
Each spring, wives, sweethearts, children, and parents lined the Anacortes waterfront as the company dispatched the Wawona to the Bering Sea cod grounds. Some crew members had to be rousted from the local saloons. They weren't always in the best of shape.
Some of them, I believe, didn't sober up until after they reached Cape Flattery and were ready to sail. It's a story I heard anyway.
David Wright is one of the last living links to the age of working sail. He remembers how long it took to sail a ship beyond the Aleutian chain.
Depending on the wind, sometimes 30 days and sometimes a little longer, sometimes a little shorter.
The schooner carried 18 dories nested on deck. When she reached the fishing grounds, the fishermen would venture onto one of the world's most remote oceans aboard the tiny dories.
We'd come to a place and the old man would holler, "Come to an anchor." Then the next morning, the dories would go out.
Breakfast was served at 4 a.m. The dories were lowered at 5. By 6, the men were fishing. Each one could feel the cold through his long wool underwear and oilskin coat.
One man to a dory. The first year I went up, as a fisherman, they tried little Briggs & Stratton air-cooled engines. No clutch on them, just straight poke. You started the engine, you were moving.
Captain Tom Hogan monitored the catch rate.
And if he decided it wasn't very good fishing there, if the men were out fishing, he'd hoist one jib up. And they had to be in a certain time or they didn't get paid for the fish once he hoisted that jib. So you always had to keep your eye on the schooner to make sure the jib wasn't up so that you could go back to the vessel in time.
Hogan didn't fit the stereotype of the gruff old sea captain.
No, he was a very, very nice guy. He was a nice fellow. I had no problems with him.
Wright had never been to sea when he signed aboard the Wawona. It took him a few days to get his sea legs.
The first year we left here, I got so seasick that I laid down on the front hatch, and one of the fishermen come up. He came up and he said, "I'll fix you up, kid." So we had pork hanging in the rigging. So he went over and cut a piece of that pork off and give it to me. He thought it'd make me sicker. But after I ate that piece of pork, I was all right. Never got sick after that.
The fishermen worked as sailors on the journey north.
The skipper set up watches. and you spent an hour at the wheel, and then you'd go down and you'd walk up and down the windward side of the sails, because if you got on the lee side, it was cold. The wind would blow underneath them and it'd just freeze to death over there, so he was always on the windward side. And that was nice. You just walk back and forth, back and forth.
For the helmsman, the trickiest part was sailing by the lee, but Wright knew how to do it.
You didn't have to worry about the compass. All you did is watch the last sail, and when you got it just luffing a little bit, why then that was where you wanted to be.
Living conditions were Spartan, but Wright didn't seem to mind.
For a boat, it was all right. They had nice bunks. There was 2 of them that run Thorpe ship. All the rest of them run fore and aft, which is the best.
Wright got his old job back after World War II, but the age of sail was waning. There'd been a change in the resource complex, with king crab displacing the codfish. But most of all, men no longer wanted to sail.
And I went up there in 1947, and that was the last trip I made up on her. I done very poorly, and usually where they caught 25,000 fish, well, a high man was 18,000, so it had dropped off that much.
From the beginning, Anacortes was a multicultural community.
In the early years, they liked to employ a lot of Chinese to come into the canneries. They also employed a lot of Native Americans. A lot of the wives of mill workers and fishermen worked in the canneries.
The Chinese were assigned jobs nobody else wanted.
In the early years, they always give them the hardest jobs. They did all the work to get the fish in the can.
When the Chinese Exclusion Act came up in 1882, there were a lot of Chinese coming in from Victoria by smuggling.
At that time, there were 300,000 Chinese in the country, and people were afraid that there was going to be a lot more of them. And it's the first time, maybe the only time in American history, that a group of people have been excluded from entering the United States.
They would come into Victoria, be held in a big brick building that looked an awful lot like a prison. They'd have to pay a head tax to get out, and then they paid the smugglers anywhere from $100 to $200 to bring them across, and they'd land them over here, and they would work in the canneries. Larry Kelly was the king of the smugglers in Puget Sound, partly because he got caught so many times. He was always in the newspaper.
He was feared by the children of Anacortes because he was a kind of a scruffy-looking fella. He was 5'6" and 180 pounds, had a bushy beard, was barefoot, wore coveralls, was a bit dirty, and the mothers in Anacortes would warn their children that if they weren't good, Smuggler Kelly would get them.
The Chinese were assigned to cut the heads off of the salmon, but were prohibited from engaging in other tasks on the processing line.
In a strange form of racism, they didn't allow the Chinese to touch the flesh of the fish.
Local Indians, white women and girls, actually handled the fish. Soon after its invention in 1902, a machine called the iron chink displaced the Chinese altogether.
After the iron chink was invented, some of the Chinese were maintained as a labor force to make cans and do some other work, but it was a very small labor force. Most of them left, and for many years there were almost no Asians in town. There may have been a few.
I'm sailing out on the ocean, out on the deep blue sea. If I get shot
1913 was a banner year for the Anacortes fishing industry.
In 1913, it's the biggest year in salmon history in Puget Sound. I don't know how many cases of salmon were put up, but it was incredible. There's been nothing like it since. My grandfather said you could practically walk across a salmon out here in Puget Sound. There were so many of them.
Then, human error decimated the Fraser River sockeye run.
Up on the Fraser River, the Canadian Railroad was going through Hell's Gate, and they were blasting, and they knocked a whole bunch of big boulders into Hell's Gate, and it made it so turbulent that the salmon could not get up the Fraser River. Most of the salmon in Puget Sound were from the Fraser River run, and it just decimated. It took them 2 years to clear it out, and it just decimated the salmon population.
An engineering effort funded by the Canadian and American governments sought to clear the blockage and restore the upriver habitat, but sockeye runs never again approached the 1913 level. As early as 1917, the Fraser River misfortune began impacting the salmon canning industry of Anacortes. The canners moved on to the cold, untapped waters of Alaska in their ever northward drift. 6 canneries stopped using their Anacortes plants in the 1920s and 1930s because of the decline in the fish population caused by the slide and by the advent of civilization on the Puget Sound. Nonetheless, fish processing endured on the Anacortes waterfront, and the fishing fleet continued to grow. If the Anacortes mills were characterized by smoke, the canneries made an olfactory impression.
Fish canneries were a bit smelly at times, particularly the fish processing plant that rendered the fish and produced glue. That plant later became known as a stink plant in town because it stank so much.
The canneries made an impression on the ears as well as the nose.
They had a whistle that would blow, and that meant you'd get to work, you'd get on your job. And they would, the foremans would always have a list of where you went to work, on what line. A lot of the canneries had 3 and 4 different lines, and they'd tell you your position on what line to go to, and that's what you'd be for that day.
The workday started early.
Most of the time before 7, and go until probably 10, 11 o'clock at night. But you know, you never worried about sleep because you were making money, and you just did what you could. You get home, take a bath, clean up, and time to go to work the next day.
Mike Demopoulos had established the Anacortes Junk Company in the pre-World War I era.
Sitting in the 1917 Mack AB. He bought it, it was his number 2 truck. He bought it in 1917 in Seattle and drove it up without a bed on it, hard rubber tires, put a bed on it and put it to work. Hauled junk and marine supplies and so forth for years around Anacortes.
Soon he progressed from junk to hardware and rechristened the business Marine Supply. His son Themo inherited the business and the long hours.
Anywhere from 2 to 4 in the morning is when they like to call me and get me out of bed to get down here and supply them with whatever, when the boat broke down. We supplied most of the boats and the canneries with all their merchandise that they needed for the machinery and the netting and everything else for the boats.
Marine Supply was situated near the waterfront in the heart of town. During the salmon years, it was a busy place.
Well, on Friday nights, it was shoulder to shoulder walking up and down the street here. The purse seine boats came in on Friday night, and that was the night for everybody to howl out here. And of course, this was a boardwalk out here in the front in those days, and they were clomping up and down. And this was the busiest part of town down this way in those days.
Always there was cultural diversity.
Many people from Norway and other Scandinavian countries, but primarily Norway, came here in the early years. Many of those were involved in the halibut industry. Also in the early years, Croatian fishermen came. Most of these people were salmon fishermen. Most of them were purse seine salmon fishermen. And so we have a rather significant population of Croatian people in town.
1960, I talked to my aunt in Gig Harbor. She said, why don't you come and make some money in summertime, start fishing here. And that's how I was introduced to Northwest fishing.
And those days there were 50 seiners tied up outside and maybe 60 gillnetters. There was very much alive. Summer was very much alive here in Anacortes those days. I understand sometimes there used to be over 5,000 fishermen in Anacortes working the boats. They used to even have fishermen night and fishermen dancing, and all that thing was going on.
Each week's fishing operations began on Monday.
Bright and early Monday morning. Most of the boats were on the grounds and ready, anchored up, ready to go when they would have a plane fly over, and when you saw that, then you knew you could go fishing.
Sockeye salmon from the Fraser River were the sought-after commodity.
That was the big money, was the sockeye salmon.
Fishermen and canneries alike competed to get product to the dock first, where the early bird just might get the best price.
A lot of boats would try to race in with the tenders would race in trying to get their fish so they could start canning early.
Fishermen got paid twice a year.
Start of the year they get a kind of a bonus check, but at the end of the year, depending on how much fish they got, they would get a bigger check, you know, and they call it a settlement check.
By 1934, there were over 80 purse seiners in the Anacortes fleet, most run by Croatians.
Well, most of the immigrants, early immigrants who came, they came from the islands of Dalmatia or Croatian coast. And later immigrants, they brought their, their families back and so forth. And since they live in Croatia by the sea, and that was familiar to them, they seafaring and fishing, and they used to have grape farms on the islands and olive trees and so forth. So they naturally was for them to settle in this area.
Nick Fahey's Veteran is a throwback to the early years that still works the salmon grounds of the Puget Sound. Today, with modern equipment like the power block, the vessel works with a crew of 5 or 6. In the old days, it took more men.
There's 10 bunks on this boat.
Really?
Yeah, so they must have needed all 10 of them. Yeah, in the ladder going down into the forecastle, you can see where at some point they reversed the ladder because they'd worn the steps out. It was worn down to the wood was that thin where the guys had gone down there. They turned it around, and now we're working on the other side. So a lot of trips were made up and down that ladder.
Before the early 1900s, gill netters fished from sailboats. They hauled the nets by hand. Around 1907, combustion engines began to be used to propel the boat, and by the early 1930s, the engine was also used to turn the drum that hauled the net.
I used to fish out at Nia Bay. I would gill net on the gill net openings, and then I would tie up my gill netter and get on a troller and go out and troll on the weekends offshore and down towards La Push and back and forth on the Washington coast, and finally go for tuna. And it was a real enjoyable life.
There were fish traps all around, active and claimed fish traps. The canneries owned most of these, not all of them, but most of them.
In 1934, concerned that the traps posed a threat to the salmon resource, the people of the state of Washington passed an initiative making them illegal. The state legislature approved the measure in 1935, and the traps were history. Illegal or not, salmon traps have always had their proponents.
You can't get much fresher fish than ones that have been brailed right out of the water, thrown into a scow, and then are taken right straight to the cannery. There's no bruises, they're beautiful, pristine fish.
In the early years, that was mainly traps.
The fish traps had a big influence on the fish runs and also on native fisheries because they occupied the spots where native peoples had fished for centuries. The fish traps really claimed their areas. And it also reduced the amount of commercial fishing that purse seiners and gill netters could do. That is, white purse seiners and gill netters. So almost everybody was in favor of getting rid of the traps except for the cannery owners.
Bill Mitchell's grandfather, Bill Beesner, was a trap man.
Bill Beesner was my grandfather, and he was quite a character. He came to Anacortes in 1912 and got a job at Fidalgo Island Packers as hammerman on a pile driver. He had a little experience with donkey engines and whatnot working out on the Sandwich Flats farming. The first Dolphin that he put in, the pile driver was 60-foot gins and a much bigger hammer, 5,600-pound hammer. And so it was a lot bigger piece of machinery, and it didn't catch it quite right, and flubbed the first few hits on the pile. And the boss on the pile driver said, "Well, you haven't hit too many piles, have you, kid?" And he said, "No, not too many." And he said, "Well, just hang in there, you'll do okay." My grandfather had great gravel in his voice, came from years and years of being on the water and lots of Canadian whiskey and cool cigarettes.
Mitchell recorded his grandfather in 1980.
Was there any trouble with people snatching the fish out of the traps?
It wasn't unless the crew was willing to sell. Mm-hmm. See, once in a while they'd come along and stick a gun and rob a trap, but most of the time the watchman or some of them would be willing to sell for a split. Mm-hmm. See, some easy money. A lot of that went on.
Great Britain became the prime market for red-fleshed fish. The fastidious English would consume only sockeye salmon. They preferred their salmon hand-packed and their labels red.
Most of these cans, the lacquer would bleed through, and then it would cover up the label, so they changed painting the labels red. Flowbell was packed on Lummi Island by Lummi Island Packing Company, and they use most of the workers, Indians, would can that salmon. Hollyleaf was the first label used by Fidalgo Island Canning Company, and it was their main label. If you notice, there's no species on it because they use it for all species. This is a Fidalgo Island Packing label. It's one of their most popular sockeye labels. It turned out to be their best moneymaker. Everybody would see the clover on there and really like the label.
Apex was an early cannery that used the most significant local landmark on its label.
They were a company that started in 1898, and that was their first label in 1899. It was the most popular label. It had a scene of Mount Baker on it, and people really were attracted to that label.
The salmon created a great deal of wealth in Anacortes, but wealth is a relative term.
The tribes here in the Northwest have been determined by the anthropologists to be the most complex and the most wealthy tribes in North America. Why? Because the superabundance of salmon. Your wealth is determined by food, having a steady source of food for the main fact, and is that since we knew how to catch the salmon, we knew how to preserve it. It also lasted us, during the winter when the fish weren't running.
White settlers who attended native potlatch ceremonies were surprised to see the Indians giving away their wealth, their salmon.
When they saw Indians giving their wealth away, it violated every principle that they had. For the non-Indian, the wealth was meant to be hoarded, putting away, so it's just only who benefits is them and their immediate little family. But they didn't realize that the tribal people had their own economic development system set up, having to deal with a perishable item. When our wealth was in salmon, if you're going to hoard salmon, it's going to spoil and no one's going to get the benefit of it. So if I give some salmon to you, it's like a debt. You owe me, and then later on you pay me back, maybe with clams or crabs. And so it's kind of a give and take relationship we always remembered. You can only have a complex society that develops laws and has spirituality when you have wealth, when you have idle time on your hands to delve into those philosophical, spiritual, and traditional aspects of your life. And so our people were extremely wealthy here, so it made us extremely complex and extremely happy people. One anthropologist I read in a study said it took a Native American man 19 hours a week to support his family in a good way. And we're saying, okay, now what does it take today to support a family? 80 plus hours, a husband and wife both working to support their family. And I would say, and you call us primitive.
Salmon has never been the only fishery on Puget Sound. Karen and Norman Thompson are Dungeness crabbers. Norm bought his own boat at 16 and the house they live in at 20.
Fishing was very good in those years, up until the 80s, I guess. A person could fish in the summer and wouldn't have to work in the winter. It was good enough that that's all you needed to do.
Fishing is harder now, and there are fewer fishermen on Puget Sound, but the professionals like the Thompsons still make a go of it.
Our season runs from the 1st of October until into March, generally. When the crab start their molt, that's when we quit fishing. We like to crab over in the islands, in the San Juans. It's beautiful, but that's not why we're there. The crabbing was good. The weather can be a little tricky coming across Rosario Straits. You can be in the islands and you're protected from the wind mostly. And then you come out and cross the straits and get the ride of your life. We've done that lots of times.
It's an Alaskan crab, the king, that has shaped the fortunes of a generation of Anacortes fishermen. Jeff Hendricks is the principal at Alaska Ocean Seafoods.
My grandparents were immigrants from Norway on both sides of my family, and they fished halibut schooners, Bering Sea. Actually, my father made deliveries here in Anacortes with his halibut schooner.
Hendricks was one of the fortunate ones. He got in on the ground floor of what would become an Alaskan boom.
Went crab fishing on the Kevlin Cay, Carl Caldestead, his boat with him, and never turned back. I was 26 years old, and that was in the winter of 1969. And we went out to Adak, the Aleutian Islands. It was fortunate timing as far as that was concerned, because the 70s turned out to be a boom in the crab industry. It just blossomed overnight.
Hendricks built his first crab boat at the Fairhaven shipyard in Bellingham. Then he brought the work to Anacortes.
I guess I might say I persuaded the owners of Fairhaven shipyard, or at least some of the key workers, to come to Anacortes and build boats here for us, and that's where we started building our other vessels. Actually, the Antares was the first vessel built in Anacortes at Dakota Creek Shipyard.
His business was family-owned and community-based.
My two partners, they're also my brother-in-laws. They were married to my wife's sisters, Jan and Nancy, and then our crews as well. That we had on the vessels came from Anacortes. So our company was literally 100% Anacortes from the 70s on.
On Valentine's Day in 1983, the company and the community suffered a heart-rending disaster. The state-of-the-art twin crabbers Americus and Altair capsized and sank a few miles apart shortly after leaving Dutch Harbor for the Bering Sea crab grounds. 14 Anacortes fishermen were dead.
As people know, in 1983 we lost those vessels, and the people that were on board were my two brother-in-laws and my nephew, and the rest of the 14 were young kids from Anacortes in their early 20s. The loss of those 14 individuals never leaves my mind, and I think about it at least weekly, and visit the memorial on occasion. But to go on for the sake of the community and for my family especially, and for the family of my brother-in-laws, it just made no sense to give up and go away. Most sense is to move on.
The firm did move on. Today it operates one of the largest, most sophisticated fishing vessels in the world. The Alaska Ocean is a floating factory where as many as 150 men and women live and work for months at a time. The enterprise brings substantial economic benefits to Anacortes and the Pacific Northwest.
And we do about 10,000 tons a year of fish products. The key employees live in Anacortes, and not only in this office, but on board the vessels are residents of Anacortes. We love the town, and our employees love the town, and we just want to be good citizens.
Anacortes, in some regards, has come full circle. It was a smoky, noisy industrial town 100 years ago. Today, it's a vacation town, a retirement town.
But as early as the 1920s, because of the reduction in the number of fish, the fish canneries were moving north to Alaska, and that process continued all the way through to the end of the 1960s, into the 70s a bit. I think the last cannery, the Shannon Point, which operated maybe as late as 1994 or 96, something like that.
The 1950s were a very significant period in Anacortes' history, and it was when the refineries came, and just a lot of things were happening, and a lot of young people came back to the community from who had gone on to college, and they came back and established their law practices and were into dentistry and so forth.
Well, the most recent boom were the oil refineries in the 50s, because there were a lot of empty stores on the main street here in Anacortes. When I first came down, it was almost a ghost town again. Anacortes seems to keep coming back. It survives.
All the canneries are done, and there's no lumber mills anymore, so it's mainly a tourist town.
People come here from Seattle and other areas to enjoy the area and to moor their boats. They come up here and then have a short trip into the San Juan, so it is a destination as a place to keep their boats, and as a place to take tours on boats, charter boats to go fishing or just to cruise.
If today's fishing industry is far less visible than it used to be, it's by no means gone.
There are 3 substantial fishing businesses in town: Trident Seafoods, and Sagayo Seafoods, and Sea Bear. Trident Seafoods processes fish sticks and makes other fish foods. Sagayo Seafoods processes pollock fish into surimi, which is an imitation crab meat. And Sea Bear processes smoked salmon and cans them in a foil wrap so they can be placed on shelves without refrigeration.
Nevertheless, the times have changed.
Well, a lot of my old friends that have passed on, and you know, you miss not seeing them because it was quite a time, you know. We had people that you knew real close, you know, like a brother or sister, and if they needed something, you would get it for them, and it was a good time.
The population has increased because of another kind of an industry, and that's a retirement industry. Many people come here to retire. Approximately 55% of the people of Anacortes are retired. They still have a few years left to play, and they like to play in their boats.
I am very happy with Anacortes. I look back on the good old days and I think of Amos Bowman and I think of my grandfather and I think of those days, and I think if they could see it today, I think they would be delighted what the New York of the West did not become, but it really is the Anacortes of the West.
I loved Anacortes, yeah. We were born and raised here. My father had always been in business here, so we knew all kinds of people, and it was a small little town. Everybody knew each other, unlike it is now, but it was a great spot.
It's changing dramatically as we speak, but it's bringing a lot of very interesting people into the community who have incredible talents.
I'm sure that if Amos Bowman came back today, he would be just thrilled to death to see all the development. Not everybody who lives here now is that thrilled with it, but he had the developer's mind. Yeah, let's sell lots of real estate.
No matter how they feel about the present day, the old-timers will never forget the fishing.
I sure miss the days of the salmon fishing. That's the thing that I like the most about Anacortes is the decade of the salmon fishermen and the salmon boats that were here, and all the families that were associated with that industry. It was a lot of fun. The kind of the jewel of the history of the fishing industry here.
And my captain once told me, he said, no man is free if he's no master of himself. And I think I quite understood that, because when you work with somebody else, you are not master of yourself. Somebody else will dictate what you do. But once you are on those boats like me and him, when you step on that bridge and take that wheel in your hands, and the wide open ocean is in front of you, the sky and the God up top of you, and you go through that, it's a special feeling of a human being, a special feeling in you, you're proud of it.
Anacortes, the perfect port.